They were three brothers with one dream, a dream that would take them from tiny stages in Australia to the top of the world. The BeeGees weren't just another band. They defined the sound of an era, blending heartbreak, melody, and that impossible harmony only brothers could share. By the late 1970s, their music was everywhere, from dance floors to movie screens, from New York to Tokyo. Their voices ruled the airwaves. But behind those angelic harmonies was a shadow. A man whose name almost disappeared from history, even though he built theirs. Robert Stigwood, a smooth-talking, fiercely ambitious producer who could turn talent into gold. He was the mastermind behind Saturday Night Fever and the one who gave the BeeGees the platform to reach superstardom. He controlled their records, their tours, their movie deals. But years later, when the spotlight turned harsh and the world began mocking the same songs that once defined a generation, the BeeGees were left alone to take the fall. Behind the scenes, something broke. Whispers started to spread through the industry that Stigwood had turned his back on the brothers when the money started to fade, that the man who once called them family had betrayed them for profit. Was it true, or was it just the cost of fame? No one ever said it out loud, but those close to the band could feel the tension long before it was visible. Because sometimes, the real heartbreak in music doesn't come from love songs. It comes from the people who were supposed to protect you. You're watching RetroWaves, where we uncover the hidden stories, betrayals, and untold truths behind music's biggest legends. If you believe the past still has secrets left to reveal, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you'll never miss another journey into the real lives behind the music. Because what you're about to hear, about the BeeGees, about fame, and about betrayal, is more than just a story. It's a reminder of how even the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. Now, let's rewind to where it all began. Back to the late 1960s, when the BeeGees first crossed paths with the man who would change their lives forever. The year was 1967. The BeeGees, Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb had just landed in London after growing up in Australia. They were still teenagers, driven by the same dream they'd carried since childhood, to make music that the world would remember. But London wasn't kind to newcomers. The Beatles ruled the charts. The Rolling Stones, The Who, and Cream had already cemented their place in history, and three unknown brothers from Brisbane didn't exactly look like the next big thing. Then came Robert Stigwood. Tall, commanding, and known for his charm and fierce negotiation skills, Stigwood was already building an empire. He had managed Cream, guided Eric Clapton, and was quickly becoming one of the most powerful names in music management. When he heard the BeeGees' demo tape, something clicked. Their harmonies were pure, their songwriting undeniable. He offered them a recording deal with Polydor Records and took them under his management company, RSO, Robert Stigwood Organization. For the brothers, it was everything they had ever wanted. Under Stigwood's direction, they released BeeGees First, a record filled with haunting melodies and poetic lyrics. New York mining disaster 1941, To Love Somebody, and Massachusetts shot them to international fame. The BeeGees had arrived, and the man behind their rise was Stigwood. To the outside world, it looked like a perfect match, but inside the group, small cracks began to form. Barry was the frontman, Robin the emotional heart, and Maurice the quiet mediator. And hovering over all three, Robert Stigwood, who now controlled their contracts, their image, and most of their earnings. According to verified interviews, the brothers often felt they had little say in major decisions. One of them later described it as being told what to be, instead of who we were. Still, they followed his lead, because every move he made worked. By the early 70s, though, things began to shift. The BeeGees' sound started to lose its spark, and record sales dropped. Rumors suggested that Stigwood was quietly redirecting his attention toward new artists and film projects. Some say he began focusing more on Eric Clapton and the film world, leaving the BeeGees to find their own direction. What's confirmed is that by 1973, the brothers were struggling, creatively and emotionally. They'd broken up once, reconciled, and were unsure if the world even wanted them anymore. Then, in a twist of fate, Robert Stigwood came back, offering them a chance to reinvent themselves under his new label, RSO. And that decision would change not just their careers, but music history itself. Because soon, the BeeGees would create one of the greatest soundtracks of all time, and what started as salvation would end as betrayal. When Robert Stigwood signed the BeeGees to his management company, it wasn't just another business move, it was a calculated risk. The music industry in the late 60s was ruthless, and family acts rarely survived beyond one or two hits. But Stigwood saw something different in the Gibbs. He didn't just sign them, he packaged them. He believed that image sold records as much as talent. He helped design their early suits, their press photos, even the way they spoke in interviews. At first, the brothers didn't question it. They were young, ambitious, and overwhelmed by the fame that came overnight. Their songs were topping charts across Europe and America, and their manager, Stigwood, seemed untouchable. He secured them prime television appearances, a relentless tour schedule, and a pipeline of hit singles. Under him, the BeeGees became a brand. But there was a price for that kind of success. Every contract, every song, every appearance went through Stigwood's company. He owned the rights, the publishing, and the business side of their fame. According to verified accounts from industry insiders, Stigwood could be charming one moment and fiercely controlling the next. He wasn't cruel, just calculating. He treated music like a chessboard, and the BeeGees were his most valuable pieces. Barry, Robin, and Maurice were grateful. But as the years went on, they began to wonder, were they partners or property? That question would follow them for decades, because while Robert Stigwood gave them everything they'd ever dreamed of, he also took control of almost everything they had. By 1977, Robert Stigwood had become one of the most powerful figures in entertainment. He didn't just manage artists anymore, he created entire worlds. His company, RSO, produced the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, the Grease soundtrack, and multiple films that defined the decade. And at the center of it all were his crown jewels, the BeeGees. After struggling in the early 70s, the brothers reinvented their sound. They moved to Miami, discovered a new groove, and built a style that blended soul, pop, and the unmistakable falsetto that would change music forever. When Stigwood heard their new songs, he saw dollar signs and history in the making. He convinced the brothers to create music for his new film project, Saturday Night Fever. The result? A cultural explosion. Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, More Than a Woman, all became instant classics. The album sold over 40 million copies, and the BeeGees became global superstars once again. But while the brothers smiled for the cameras, the pressure behind the scenes was enormous. Stigwood was juggling movie deals, record contracts, and egos. The BeeGees were exhausted, performing non-stop, promoting non-stop, recording non-stop. According to confirmed interviews with Barry Gibb, the brothers were grateful for Stigwood's vision, but they felt trapped by the machine he'd built. Every move was about marketing, every song was a product. Barry later admitted, "We were the soundtrack of our own imprisonment." Still, no one could deny Stigwood's genius. He had turned a struggling band into a cultural empire. But success can be the slowest kind of poison. As the money grew, so did the control. And when disco's popularity started to fade, the brothers realized just how much of their destiny was tied to one man's empire. The world saw the glitter, but behind closed doors, resentment was growing. Fame had made them rich, but it had also made them powerless. By 1979, the BeeGees were at their peak. They had 6 consecutive #1 singles in the US, millions of fans, and one of the most successful albums of all time. But behind that success, tension was boiling. Robert Stigwood owned RSO, the record label, the publishing, and even parts of the merchandising. That meant that nearly everything the BeeGees did passed through his hands first. In verified reports, Maurice Gibb once described it as living in someone else's house. Even though your name is on the door, the brothers began to push for more control over their music and their image. Barry wanted creative freedom. Robin wanted recognition as a songwriter. Maurice just wanted peace between them all. But business and family don't mix easily. And under Stigwood's rule, the BeeGees were no longer just musicians, they were a franchise. According to insiders, there were heated meetings about royalties, film rights, and how much credit the brothers really received for the Saturday Night Fever phenomenon. Some say Stigwood became distant, focusing on his film empire, including Grease and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. When that last film flopped, and critics mocked both Stigwood and the BeeGees, the partnership started to crumble. The backlash against disco was growing, and the BeeGees' association with the genre made them targets. Radio stations stopped playing their songs. People burned their records in stadiums. And Stigwood, the man who once stood proudly beside them, began to fade into the background. He had other projects, other stars, and other priorities. The BeeGees, once the center of his world, suddenly felt like outsiders in their own story. In public, they stayed professional. In private, the trust had been broken. And when the world turned against disco, it wasn't Robert Stigwood who took the blame. It was the brothers. By 1980, the BeeGees were everywhere and nowhere. Their fame had reached a point where it wasn't just about music anymore. It was political. The disco boom had created millions of fans and millions of haters. Radio DJs were calling for disco demolition nights. Stadiums were filled with crowds burning BeeGees records. What began as rebellion against a genre turned into something darker, almost personal. The BeeGees became the face of disco, and when people wanted to destroy disco, they destroyed them. They couldn't walk into restaurants without mockery. Even fellow musicians started to distance themselves. Through it all, Robert Stigwood was silent. The man who had once stood beside them on red carpets and award stages was suddenly nowhere to be found. Verified reports show that by this time, Stigwood was focusing more on his film ventures such as Times Square and Grease 2. The BeeGees, his once prized artists, were left to face the storm alone. According to Robert Gibb in later interviews, "We became a punchline overnight, and there was no one standing up for us." Some industry insiders, though not confirmed by official records, claimed that Stigwood had quietly shifted his priorities, trying to protect his business reputation as disco collapsed. Others said he simply believed the BeeGees needed to weather the storm. Either way, the silence was deafening. The brothers had given him their trust. Now, they were the targets of ridicule, and their manager, their supposed protector, had disappeared from the front lines. For the first time, the brothers realized they were fighting this war alone, and fame, once their greatest ally, had become their enemy. The year 1980 marked the end of an era. Saturday Night Fever was still one of the best-selling albums of all time, but the public had turned against the sound that made it famous. The BeeGees were banned from radio stations that once played them non-stop. They couldn't even release a single without it being labeled as disco trash. Inside the group, the atmosphere grew heavy. Years of constant touring, studio pressure, and backlash took a toll. Barry, Robin, and Maurice began to question everything, including their partnership with Robert Stigwood. According to confirmed interviews, the brothers had stopped feeling like artists and started feeling like ghosts of their former selves. They had created a cultural phenomenon, yet they were being punished for it. Meanwhile, Stigwood's empire, RSO Records, began to crumble under its own weight. The Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band movie, which he had produced with the BeeGees, was a massive flop. Critics tore it apart. Audiences laughed. That failure sent shockwaves through both their careers. It wasn't just a bad movie, it was a humiliation. Rumors at the time, never officially confirmed, suggested that Stigwood and the BeeGees had deep disagreements after the disaster. Some insiders claimed they blamed each other. Others said Stigwood retreated from public view, embarrassed by the backlash. What is confirmed is that by the early 80s the relationship had fractured. The BeeGees were still under RSO, but they were no longer close to Stigwood. They began writing songs for other artists, Dionne Warwick, Barbra Streisand, and Diana Ross, quietly rebuilding their credibility from the sidelines. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the brothers were operating without Robert Stigwood guiding every decision. He had once made them legends. Now they were learning how to survive without him. It wasn't just a career shift, it was liberation through heartbreak. As the years passed, time softened some wounds, but not all. Robert Stigwood retreated from the spotlight. He still worked in film and theater, producing occasional projects, but his golden era was over. The BeeGees, on the other hand, slowly rose again. By the late 1980s, they had reinvented themselves as respected songwriters and performers. Their hits for other artists topped charts, and their comeback album, One, brought them renewed respect. They rarely spoke publicly about their split with Stigwood, but their silence said enough. In interviews, Robert Gibb often credited Stigwood for their success, but his tone was bittersweet. He called him a man who believed in us when no one else did, and yet those close to the brothers could sense the unspoken pain behind the gratitude. Rumors circulated, again unverified, that the brothers felt Stigwood had profited far more than they ever did, that he owned more of their legacy than they wished to admit. But they never said it aloud, not publicly, not officially. Instead, they moved on, focusing on music, family, and the quiet dignity of survival. When Maurice Gibb passed away in 2003, Robert Stigwood sent his condolences. It was the only public sign of connection between them in decades. And when Stigwood himself died in 2016, Robert Gibb spoke with respect, calling him a great man who gave us everything. But if you listen closely to Barry's words, you can hear something else, a kind of sadness, maybe even forgiveness, for the man who helped build their empire and then walked away when it fell. For years, the story of Robert Stigwood and the BeeGees lived in the shadows, a quiet chapter everyone in the industry seemed to know about, but few dared to discuss. Behind the smiles and polite words in interviews, there was something unresolved, something that never quite healed. Verified reports show that during the 1980s, the BeeGees worked hard to distance themselves from the disco label, while Stigwood was quietly untangling his finances from RSO's collapse. He had earned millions, some say hundreds of millions, from the brothers' work. Was it fair? That depends on who you ask. Legally, Stigwood had the contracts. Artistically, the BeeGees had the magic. But emotionally, that's where the real imbalance was. The brothers had trusted him with their lives, and for a time, that trust was rewarded with success. But when things fell apart, it felt, at least to them, like their father figure in the industry had disappeared. Rumors have long circulated, though never verified, that Robin Gibb carried resentment for years, believing Stigwood prioritized money over loyalty. Barry, in contrast, seemed more forgiving. He once said, "Robert gave us everything we wanted." But sometimes you can't expect someone to give you their soul, too. It's unclear whether Stigwood and the brothers ever had a full emotional reconciliation. Some close associates claim that Barry reached out privately in later years to thank him for the foundation he'd given them. Others insist they kept their distance. No official record confirms either version. But what's certain is this. Without Robert Stigwood, there would be no Saturday Night Fever, no BeeGees as we know them. And yet, without the BeeGees, Robert Stigwood's empire would never have shined as bright as it did. They made each other and broke each other all at once. In the final years of his life, Robert Stigwood lived quietly in England, far from the noise of the music world he once ruled. He rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared at public events. The empire he'd built in the 1970s was gone, but his influence remained everywhere. He had managed Cream, guided Clapton, and produced two of the biggest soundtracks in history. He had made millions of people dance, cry, and dream. But what mattered most, the relationships, had mostly faded away. The BeeGees had moved on too. They were now elder statesmen of pop, honored for their songwriting brilliance rather than just their falsettos. When asked about their past, they spoke carefully, never attacking Stigwood, but never forgetting. Barry Gibb, in particular, chose grace over bitterness. When Robert Stigwood passed away in 2016, Barry released a short, heartfelt message. He believed in us when nobody else did. He was a great man who changed our lives forever. It was short, respectful, and full of meaning. Today, when people hear the BeeGees, they think of shimmering lights, disco balls, and timeless harmonies. But behind every note, there's a story of survival and a lesson about trust. Robert Stigwood didn't just build the BeeGees' career. He shaped an era. He was a visionary who saw potential where others saw risk. He helped three brothers from a small island find their voice, and the world never forgot that sound. But success, like music, is about timing. And when the beat changed, so did the loyalty. The BeeGees survived long after Stigwood faded from the spotlight. They endured heartbreak, loss, and even tragedy, but they kept singing. Because for them, music wasn't about contracts or charts. It was about the bond they shared, the one thing no producer, no betrayal, could ever take away. When Barry Gibb performs To Love Somebody today, there's a quiet weight in his voice. It's not just a song about love. It's a song about trust, about giving everything you have to someone and hoping they don't let go. Maybe that's why the story of Robert Stigwood still echoes in music history, because it's not a story of villains and victims. It's a story of ambition, loyalty, and the fragile line between partnership and possession. And in the end, the man who made the BeeGees legends also became the symbol of the one thing they could never escape: the price of fame. You've been watching RetroWaves, where every legend has a truth the world forgot to tell.